because number one problem that you hear about all the time in this city has definitely to be about traffic mobility. So I welcome you, and I applaud you for coming through thick and thin. We think it is the traffic from Churchill in Collins Avenue. I live up there. We have lived in tortured for the past 5 or 6 days while this boat show is going. Good news, by the way, is it's not coming back anymore. It's coming down to City of Miami. So welcome and thank you. We have some wonderful speakers today. I've been trying to get Victor, how many years? 10, 15 years to come and talk to all of our on our MBU.
I've been trying to say yes too.
I know you always said yes, but there was always the but after the yes.
Ask me sooner next time, and you did. Thank you. Now here I am.
And Tom and Tony are my heroes. They have been here through thick and thin. It was before we even met here. Remember, we were crammed into the golf course, and they hurried us out the door so they could close it. But they have been our speakers. Well, Tom, whatever the subject is, I always call Tom. He's the man for all images to come and talk to us. I want to mention a couple of things that MBU is involved in. We are continuing to do our forums. We haven't been able to have as many as we've had in past years because of the hurricane and a lot of changes that we had in the MBU organization. But we're getting ready to have quite a few more. The next forum is going to be about the GO bond. That is a very big issue, probably a bigger issue than even the transportation. We are going to have the finance director as a speaker, and Ricky Ariel, the commissioner, is going to be on the podium with him to talk about how the city is putting together a GO bond. It will take more meeting. There's going to be a lot of meetings coming up to it, and it really is a way for you to understand how we are going to fund all the wonderful things that we want to have in this city. North Beach and the master plan, where's the money going to come from? This is the city borrowing money to support the good things that are supposed to happen here. So stay tuned to it. We have on May 8th, we're going to have the forum and talk it up with the people you know. It's something you need to know. It's how your money is going to be spent. Obviously, by the name of GO bond, it means that the city is going to borrow money, and that is paid back, obviously, by the residents of the city. So everybody should be tuned into it. Another thing that we're following is the problems that are happening in the historic districts with the fire department. Our local fire chief is doing a wonderful job trying to help us. But what's happening is that the beautiful railings on the historic buildings are not according to code. They're 60 and 70-year-old buildings that have been here forever, and suddenly they don't meet the code. So we have been trying to gather momentum in the community to make change in Tallahassee. There is a bill floating to rectify some of the problem. It has 2.5 weeks, and the session in Tallahassee will end, and hopefully the bill that is floating, we're attached to it about these railing problems. hopefully it'll pass. Otherwise, this is going to be a lot of work next year to try to bring it back to the legislature next year to try to make change. Meanwhile, the fire department's been very kind. They are not going after, really going after the violations. They're giving us time to make change in Tallahassee. We have the support of the Historic Preservation Board for this, and now we're working on having the support of the City Commission. So those are some of the things we're doing, and we meet once a month, we meet regularly, we have a Government Affairs Committee that goes through with a fine-tooth comb, goes through all of all of the agenda items that are coming to the Commission, and that's in preparation for those of you who have been with us for many times have heard about our report card. We are doing a report card on the actions of the committee. And we send resolutions and we're working together and trying to get everybody on the same page. We're doing the report card really to keep people to understand what the commission is doing. Just stay tuned to what we're doing. We have been sending out a newsletter. Do we have one coming soon?
We just sent one out, and we will again soon, yes.
And on that note, I'm going to introduce you to the person who writes the newsletter and who is my co-president. We now have double duty presidents, and Tanya and I. Tanya, you probably all know Tanya. Tanya is going to introduce the speakers. So thank you again for coming. Come back again the next time you get an invitation from us.
So thank you for coming. I also wanted to mention, in addition to the forums that we are putting together over the course of the year, we also, as you know, do social events at pretty cool venues. And so if you're not a member yet, that is a great reason to join, because the social events are free to members and in wonderful places with lovely things to eat and drink and cool people to do that with. So we encourage you to become a member if you're not already. Before we even start this wonderful event, I want to thank Wanda Musan, who is seated over there, for putting together this forum. It's a topic near and dear to her heart for a number of reasons, but she's also spearheading forums on other topics over the course of the year. So if there's something that you think merits the attention of a forum, let us know, and we'd love to toss it into the hopper. But so I wanted to introduce everybody. You got a preliminary introduction from Nancy, but and I'm sure these names are quite familiar to you, but you may not know how awesome these three gentlemen actually are. So they are going to be speaking on the topic of street design, smart street design, and how it can impact and improve residents' quality of life throughout the city in a number of different ways. So Victor Dover, in the white shirt at the far end over there, is an expert on how to fix our streets and in the process shape enduring cities that people really love. He is one of the founding principals of Dover Coal, a name which you may know from the master plan, the master plan for North Beach, rather. So much top of mind for me, I figured that everybody always knows which master plan I'm talking about. And he serves as principal in charge for many of the firm's planning and design projects. Victor lectures widely around the nation on topics of livable communities and sustainable development, and was national chair of the Congress for New Urbanism from 2010 to 2012. He recently co-authored with John Massengale the best-selling book, Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. So you're getting a little secret tonight. Victor has been awarded the John Nolan Medal for contributions to urbanism and is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Miami. He is also a bike commuter, a constant traveler, and 4-time Ironman triathlete. And he focuses on reestablishing healthy, economically sound neighborhoods. So the reason I'm throwing this in is because he not only does this stuff for a living, but he's riding on the streets for transportation and training as well. Next, we have Tony Garcia in the check shirt over towards my right. He is a principal of Street Plans Collaborative, a firm founded in Miami Beach in 2009, and leads the firm's Miami office. He is a nationally recognized architect, writer, speaker, and advocate in the field of transit, pedestrian, and bicycle infrastructure, and is an expert on urban design, street growth, tactical urbanism, and complete streets and active transportation. In addition to that, he is frequently featured in national publications and is also a published author. Most recently, in collaboration with Mike Bryden, is the recipient of the 2017 Seaside Prize and co-author of Tactical Urbanism, published in 2015. He is also very deeply involved in bicycle communities, commuting, linking bicycles and pedestrians and roadways. And if you have heard about the Ludlam Trail Project, which is a pretty exciting project, that is going to be adding over 50 acres of new park space to Miami-Dade County. So just a few things over here. And then last but of course not least is our very own Tom Mooney, who everybody knows, but there are a few things you might not know about him. So Tom Mooney has been with the City of Miami Beach since 1993 and has, where he joined as a senior planner, overseeing the design, review, and historic preservation functions of the planning department. The few roles in between then and now, he is now, of course, the director of planning for the entire City of Miami Beach. He's been in that role since 2014. He's a certified professional planner with the American Institute of Certified Planners. He has served as treasurer and chair of the Gold Coast Section Florida chapter of the American Planning Association, among many other organizations. And locally, Mr. Mooney has served, so formal. Tom has served on the board of directors of Dade Heritage Trust, the Tropical Pioneers of the Historical Museum of South Florida, which you now know as History Miami. And he's a graduate of Miami Design Preservation League's Tour Guide Academy and is a certified historic district tour guide, as well as also an avid cyclist and triathlete. The reason why I gave you these very long introductions, which may not be normal, is because these three gentlemen not only know whereof they speak professionally, but they have a lot of relevant experience as residents and users of streets in our municipality, and I thought that having that insight on their background would help inform the way you receive the information that you are about to hear this evening. So, without further ado, I turn it over to the panel.
I'll start. Is that the mic you want me to use?
Whichever one. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I work in Miami Beach from time to time, as we did on the North Beach plan. I don't live here, so consider me a carpetbagger from South Miami. However, I think a lot of my own thinking about streets was crystallized in Miami Beach, because all of the issues about what streets have become during our lifetimes and what they need to become during our children's lifetimes are on display here. And I hope that becomes clear. Streets matter a whole lot, and I'll start off with a rah-rah about why that is so, and also maybe a little bit of a provoking on the topic of what streets can and can't do well, and what we need to do beyond street thing. Then Tony will talk, and we'll get Tom to correct whatever we said wrong. I do have the best job in the whole wide world. For like the last 30 years, what Joe Cole and I have been doing is traveling around the country helping people by making before and after pictures. That's what we did. I mean, in the before and after business, we help people visualize change, and sometimes that means converting the place that they don't like very much or that turned out to be too brittle economically into something that will be more lasting and more worth having. And that, of course, is what urbanism is. It's visualizing change and then choosing change that will make things better rather than worse. That's the job. Pretty fun thing to do. And then we learned a lot as we went. Learned from pretty smart people. Ed Glazer, the Harvard economist, for example, taught us something pretty useful. He said, forget the wheel, forget the discovery of fire. The most important thing humans ever invented was the city. That the city was the greatest invention ever. And that the way we make a city is first with streets. You know, you can go to a Roman street or a Japanese street or a Dutch street. But basically the streets are the way we read that greatest invention. Why are cities so useful? Why are they such great inventions? It's partly a vessel for our daily activities. You know, the city is made up of our homes and our places of work, and keep the rain off while we're doing those activities. But it's also where we tell the story of our civilization. It's more than just a practical everyday need. It's a communications device. And so I like to think about cities that way. And a few years ago, John Massengale and I were asked to write a textbook on street design, because we always come back to the idea that the street design is the most important aspect of city making. It's the thing most often gotten wrong, present company excepted, we'll say. But it is also the thing that matters the most. We need to get better at. We thought this would be really easy. We've been thinking about streets for a really long time. I said to John, street design, that'll be easy. Well, we've been working on this for a long time. We'll just knock it out by Christmas. But it took us about 3.5 more Christmases to get to the finish line. And we traveled a lot. And we took a lot of pictures, and we measured a lot of streets. And we asked our friends, what streets do you think are the most successful? Which ones have problems? Why are some better than others? And then we stayed up at night really late arguing about why some were more successful than others, and boiled that down into this book. It has 500 pictures in it. By the time we were done, we realized we didn't know as much as we thought. We learned a lot. But we also had produced what we hope is a subversive tool, in a way, that citizens from Miami Beach could take to a meeting with their planning director, their transportation director, or the mayor, or the city manager, or the fire department, and slide across the table and point to one of the 500 pictures in the book and say, how come we can't have a street like that in our town? And if that happens even just once, will you let me know? Because that would make it all the effort to So why the obsession over streets? Well, because it's between the buildings, not inside the buildings, where we tell the story of our place. And if you believe what I just said, that the cities are more than just wires and pipes and square footages, they're a communications device. The story that we tell when the space between buildings isn't very good is an unhappy story. It also turns out to be the place where the property values are low and the tax base is weak and the safety is bad. And so by comparison, when we go to the places where the space between the buildings is a place where people want to be, then we see all of those things are the reverse. The tax base is strong, the magnetism to visitors is strong. Here in South Florida, we have a tourism-driven economy. Certainly we have other things going on as well. But we have quite an urban design industry, actually. But the tourism is really important to our well-being, and our success here depends entirely on the quality of the experiences we give to the visitors when they come, and whether they will tell others that's a good place to go, you should go back there, whether they will say to their spouse or their family members, let's go there again, let's go stay longer, let's spend more money on the next trip. Everything depends on that. Well, so when we go to the places where people seem to really want to be and they come in great quantities, we find positive street spaces. And those are often the places where the needs for pedestrians and people on bikes are in a better balance with the needs of those behind the wheel motoring than they are in the places where the public realm is really weak. So we decided to try and document that. I realized through the traveling and measuring that actually Americans were once really, really good at this. We were probably as good at it as any civilization, and street design's always been a hallmark of advanced civilizations. Like in this scene, for example, they made a decision where that street turned to position this important civic building right on that axis and put that lantern at the end of that long vista. So you couldn't help but get a message from this place about the importance that city placed on the institution inside that building. It was more than square feet and pipes and traffic capacity. Also learned by looking at historical examples and then more recent ones that the beleaguered public officials, sorry guys, were once heroes in their communities. They were tasked with things like in this situation, straightening out a medieval tangle of streets. That's an 18th and 19th century road widening project. But it doesn't look like what comes to mind when I say road widening project. But when they rebuilt that street, they did more than just sort out a traffic tangle. They created the postcard picture of that city. They created the most prestigious and best address in that city, the place where if you had a hotel or a gallery or a restaurant, you would want to be. And if you were going to visit a hotel or a restaurant or a gallery, you would choose that street to do so. Now, we live in an interesting time because after abandoning those kind of lofty ideals for a lot of decades, these days transportation officials and public works officials are becoming again heroes, at least from time to time. Jeanette Sadiq Khan, who was transportation commissioner in New York City under Mayor Bloomberg, was one of those. And she was the first one in that job to use the vast power of her office to make things better for people on 2 feet and 2 wheels instead of worse. In fact, that intersection you might recognize in Madison Square in front of the famous Flatiron Building. Jeanette sent her crews out in the middle of the night with truckloads of old boulders and leftover things from parks projects and what have you, and big pots with plants in them, and epoxy paint, and some movable tables and chairs. And she turned all that car space into people space. It was a pilot project, so they didn't ask a lot of people for permission. Many were surprised the next morning. But what happened is interesting. New Yorkers came streaming out of those towers and down there and started using those movable tables and chairs. Here's the amazing thing. They knew exactly what to do. As human beings, we remember how to use pedestrian space when it's finally provided for us. So if you buy this idea that streets matter a lot, then you know that Miami Beach is a very interesting cauldron laboratory, really for that kind of work. And there's a tradition in Miami Beach of inheriting the streets the way they used to be and then changing them into something else. That certainly occurred in several successive stages with Lincoln Road. It also occurred with Espanola Way. We held a contest a few years ago to name South Florida's best block with the Miami Herald. And there was a vigorous campaign waged by all parties. But the hands down winner was Espanola Way. It was everybody in South Florida, not just the people in Miami Beach, that weighed in on that, made it the winner by a country mile over all of the other really excellent streets that were considered. What that makes me want to point out is that it hasn't always been that way. Espanola Way always had special architecture and a great story to tell, but the street itself, the space between the buildings, was not that distinctive in the beginning. It took a while, and it took several successive layers, digging away and painting on that same canvas for generations to make timely upgrades when it was their turn to get to the Espanola Way we love now. And that philosophy that the city is always changing and the streets you've got are not stuck, they can evolve, is a philosophy I would suggest you adopt. Now, there's a lot of variety. Places that are memorable. This is a perennial winner in the America's Best Main Street contest. That's in Galena, Illinois. The streets that are memorable have some local distinctiveness that jumps out, like they made those brick buildings out of the clay that came from nearby. Anybody want to hazard a guess what city that is? It's very easy, right?
Yeah.
So this is the Avenue Diana, which is a great street, but it's also memorable partly because it has this grand marble accessory at the end, quite a decoration, the Arc de Triomphe. But it's also memorable because of those tree lines. What you may not know about the Avenue Diana is that it's the most beautiful parking lot in the world. There are more than 400 cars parked in each block, which gives it a per acre ratio really close to the Walmart parking lot in terms of the number of parking spaces delivered. So there you go, the most beautiful parking lot in the world isn't a parking lot at all, it's a street. So you can have a street like that. Sometimes the wide streets are the distinctive streets. Sometimes it's the skinny ones. Sometimes it's the one with public space in the center of the street, or a thing in the middle of the road, or more space on the sides for the traditional activities in that place. Sometimes it's a main street. Sometimes it's a skinny street. Sometimes it's a street without street trees. Sometimes it's a street where the whole thing is about that one tree that changes the composition and your experience of the place. So when we made this travel, there was a moment when the whole thing became kind of clear to me why we were doing it. And it was in this spot. This is in Stockholm. And I saw this alley of trees, lined up, and it's quite beautiful. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to take a picture of that, midwinter picture. It'll balance out all my palm trees in my slides. And I went out to the center of the street and I waited, and I saw this fellow on a bike in the distance, and he was coming toward me. So I said, well, this is perfect. It's freezing, but I took a knee and I waited with my camera for him to get just into the right place in the frame to snap that picture. And as he got closer, I realized something amazing. He was whistling. Now, it was about 10 minutes after 5 in the afternoon. He was dressed for work, not for exercise. He was on his way home. This is his commute, his daily commute. And during his daily commute, the most miserable of times for most people in South Florida, he was having the time of his life. It was the most joyous part of his day. He was whistling. And I said, gosh, why don't we try to make the experiences of everyday life that good? And how did it get that good for him? And the way it got that good for him was that somebody bothered drawing 2 lines on a map and planting those trees in a row. It's pretty simple, right? Not complicated. But because they did, he gets that experience. It's like this inheritance because somebody bothered to plant trees that won't grow to their maturity during the lifetimes of the people who bothered to plant them. But they gave him this gift. And not just him, but the cyclist behind him and the person on foot behind him. So there are a lot of little technicalities to how you make successful streets. One is that they have a shape. That usually comes from having rules about where the buildings should be, instead of just rules about where the buildings should not be. You want to see that comparison again? In this one, the rule says the buildings line up with each other and the storefronts are connected. And in this one, it says there's an imaginary line in the land development code that says as long as you're behind it, you can put your building wherever you want. Big difference. The streets that are successful seem to be very comfortable, depending on where they are weather-wise. Crucial for us. If you go a little farther north, like this is in the Mid-Atlantic, and they have those deciduous trees that let the sun in the winter to warm the place up and filter the sunlight in the summer to keep the place cool. That's a key to the comfort, right? And if you go to a hot, sticky place, this is Barcelona, for example, there are also trees doing those jobs, but the architecture is asked to do more, just like the eyebrows on our Miami Beach buildings are doing the same thing. So, now why do I think this is important? There are a lot of things about daily life that are made better when you have better street design. And you can think, well, the safety will be better, right? You won't get run over if you try to cross in a crosswalk, or if they have a car-on-car crash, there will be less violence and mayhem as a result. But there are other things that get better, like, for example, the exchange of ideas. If you ask that economist why cities are such a big deal, he'd say, because cities are where we come together to make our economic exchanges and our social exchanges, but also to share ideas with each other. Now, in this intersection, these guys standing there on the corner around the bike and lamppost are about a block away from the BBC headquarters in London. It's one of the busiest, most bustling, noisiest, traffic-clogged parts of London. And yet this intersection, when the cars go down that street, like the white one you see in the distance, they're asked to slow down, rise up to the level of the crosswalk, go across slowly, and then enter the space. They are always moving on the pedestrian's terms. These guys have their back to traffic. The guy with the briefcase, he's not worried at all about getting killed by a car that's terrorizing around that corner. And that's all because of the design of the place. Do I think we have a lot of opportunities to make changes that would illustrate that philosophy in action? You bet we do. One, I'll tease up Tony and then you can finish it, is right in North Beach, where at Reuben Dome and 71st and Normandy Drive, the plan for North Beach illustrates just those kind of interventions to turn it from an all-car space to a place that really works for cars and people that are not in cars. Now, to get to safety and to get to comfort, we have to get the speed down. This is a little counterintuitive for a lot of people because as motorists, we like to press the accelerator and it feels like our cars are just technically capable of going so fast that it's unnatural to ask them to go slow. But in truth, going slow saves a lot of lives. Speed kills. And this little diagram shows why. And I think one thing that's important to remember is that the people on bikes are a complicated species. They're not monolithic, they're not all the same. The fellow on the left in this scene is where all three of these cyclists have a lot of space devoted to them and buses and taxis, where they can ride separated from the cars. The guy on the left is there for exercise. He's clipped in, he's in the drops, he's wearing his exercise clothes. Actually, that's a mammal, technically. A middle-aged man in lycra, not my joke. Now, next to him, the young lady is in casual clothing, and she's not wearing a helmet, and she's sitting upright, and she's moving more slowly. She's not clipped in, she's wearing sneakers. So she's a different kind of cyclist from the strong and fearless athlete guy over on the left. And then if you look to the right side of the picture, there's a fellow dressed for work, with a backpack on. He's older, see some gray hair in that picture, and he's taking a break on the side of the road with his foot on the curb to catch his breath before proceeding the rest of his trip. He's a different kind of cyclist. And so we can't take, just like we wouldn't for a second imagine that all of the people in cars are the same, or they drive the same kind of car, or they drive the same way, or they have the same attitudes. You shouldn't assume the same for pedestrians. You have to assume that pedestrians are different and cyclists are different too. Although your peer communities in vacation destinations especially are getting really good at this. They build streets or they rebuild streets. They use a vast proportion of, this one's in Brazil, in a tourist location. They use a vast proportion of the right-of-way for the pedestrian and the amenities the pedestrian's expecting, like street trees and places to sit. And they happily share that space with their kids and people on bikes and vendors and so on. And there are cars in the street, it's just not all about cars. See the difference? On the other hand, Tanya mentioned complete streets earlier. The complete streets movement is a really important thing where I think a lot of us in this room are participants in that. It has the best bumper sticker of a name ever. After all, who would want an incomplete street? But I think we're at the very beginning, baby step stages of defining what a complete street really means. Now this was a good project. This was in Fort Lauderdale. They narrowed the street visually. They painted it differently so the lanes got narrower. They made some space for bikes. They added some on-street parking. But when I look at that picture, I can't help but think that's not a complete street. So if you take something away from me, take this. If it's not yet a beautiful street, it's not a complete street. And you can't get a complete street if you just work inside the curves. You get a complete street by thinking of the whole ensemble of the architecture, the street trees, and the elements that are on the horizontal plane down below. There's another complete street. So this is a complete street in a more mature civilization. Okay. And in that scene, there are people making deliveries, and there are people walking by storefronts, and there are cars going to their destinations, and there are passengers on bus rapid transit, and there are bikes in separated bike lanes, and there are more pedestrians in the big promenade with those paired trees, and there's a subway right underneath. And that seems a bit more complete to me. We have experiments underway. In Coral Gables, you might have heard recently, they temporarily took a lane of car space and turned it into bike space and used these planters with beautiful plants coming out of them to separate the two. And it made for a short 60-day experiment the most comfortable place to ride in the Gables. Kind of a hint. And also maybe reassured us in a way that in a place as sensitive as the Gables about the way their streets look and the look and feel of their community, you could do complete streets interventions that were beautiful, not just bright green paint. So before and after means we'll be able to rethink how we use a lot of this space. Now, for the disclaimer, I told Wanda after our preparation call and you told me what was on your mind, I threw away my presentation and replaced it because I wanted to make sure that I made this point. There are a lot of things that are made better by better street design, like I said. Some are really, really important to us here locally. However, street design isn't really a cure-all. It cures a lot of things, and it makes a lot of things better, but it doesn't solve everything. It's not going to eliminate tooth decay. It's not going to explain what happened to JFK. It's not going to tell us where to find Jimmy Hoffa's body. And it isn't going to eliminate traffic congestion. Sorry, that's a bearer of bad news. Traffic congestion. Streets in Miami Beach are congested at the peak hour with traffic, and they are going to be congested from now until the end of time. So, as much as I'd like to be able to tell you that we can do better street designs and the traffic congestion will magically evaporate, that's not going to be the case. But if you accept and embrace that idea that the congestion is in fact inevitable because you are a place where people want to be, then why not get on with the business of making a place that works for everything else, that satisfies your livability goals? Well, I know you have been doing that, but I thought it would be worth reminding, because of the constant drumbeat about traffic congestion in the beach, it would be worth reminding you what not to do about congestion. First, don't gripe about the additional traffic and how that's taking away the road space and think you're going to solve it by adding more space for cars. Adding more space for cars will not get you what you want, because if you do it, you probably would do it with the idea of taking those slow-moving trips and making them fast trips again, right? Seems like a good intention. But when you do, all you're going to do is facilitate people making longer trips. So if you build infrastructure to make it possible for people to go fast, the inevitable result is that instead they roam farther in cars. So instead of going a few blocks to their neighborhood hardware store, they go a few miles or a few more miles to a big orange building that has hardware in it. You see the kind of change? Okay, so the futurist Clem Heimstra actually explained this really, really well with this one phrase. It says, trying to cure traffic congestion with more capacity is like trying to cure obesity by loosening your belt. Another way to think about it is this: if you have a fire in this building and you run to the fire extinguisher, you read the label before you start to squirt the fire extinguisher at it, it will say in big bold letters, aim at the base of the fire. Not up here at the smoke and the flames, but down at the fuel source where the problem starts. And the problem starts in traffic congestion with being too dependent on automobiles for everyday life. Now, if that matters to you now, it's going to matter to you more in the future. Our region, the 7 counties of Southeast Florida, have a little over 6 million people. In 2060, we'll have 9.5 million people. That's a big change. And so we're going to grow by 50% more. We're going to add about the same number of people that we added between 1960 and 2010. And that change will mean there's going to be a lot more people moving around. So if you're mad about traffic congestion because you're stuck in your car, even if you are absolutely committed to sticking with that car every time for every trip yourself, you don't want all those new people doing the same thing. You want to make it easy for them to choose walking, biking, or transit, if at all possible. And if you're committed to making long trips, you want them to make short trips, so they are stealing your lane for a lot less of your day. Now, how do you do that? And why would it matter? This is a kind of a famous graphic that illustrates the difference between 40 or so people in a bus or a trolley. The same number on bikes, it takes a little more space, versus the same number where there's 1 person per car. If you think we're running out of road and we don't have enough space for all this traffic, then what you need to do is figure out how to get those people that are choosing to drive alone to carpool or use walking, biking, and transit. There's another way of illustrating the same thing. The people who fit in these buses or that train on the right side take a vastly larger amount of space to drive with 1 or 1.5 persons per car. And that's where the traffic congestion is coming from. Now, what do you do as community leaders about this? Our old friend Walter Kulach diagrammed this really well, so I'll use his illustration. Basically, this is engineering, the only engineering diagram on the show. As the years go by, the amount of traffic rises, and eventually it rises to the point where it exceeds the capacity provided by the transportation facility, otherwise known as road. And so at some point, you let that go on for a while, and it gets worse and worse until finally somebody says, we've got to do something about all this traffic. And so they build a highway, or they build an interchange, or they widen the road. Now they suddenly have a lot more capacity. Everybody can finally breathe a sigh of relief because it's all going to work out and we have enough capacity on this newly built road to satisfy the future demand. And everything ended with peace and happiness, right? This isn't actually what happens. What actually happens is different. What happens is that since you built something to make it possible for people to go faster, they went farther, and more of them did it. And they separated things that they need in their daily lives by more miles, and they drive more. So now traffic engineers know to call this induced travel demand, or induced traffic. So as a result of the induced traffic, before long, the amount of traffic rises to the point where it once again, just like before, exceeds the capacity of the road to support that many cars. So what do? Well, if you're like Americans for the preceding 60 years, you do it again. You widen the road again, and the same thing happens again. And so at any point, we just get to a point with congestion, and then we think that we're going to be able to widen our way out of it. Doesn't actually work. And the real question isn't whether you're going to have congestion. The question is what kind of community you're going to have where that congestion occurs. So this is now well documented. 20 years ago, we couldn't find any literature about it. There's tons now to explain in great detail. If somebody tells you they need to do something about traffic capacity, then you ask them what they're doing about induced travel demand. Now, what will be true every time, in addition to the bad news I just gave? What will also be true is that we need places. If you make places where people that just exited a transit vehicle, public transit vehicle, feel comfortable as pedestrians, then you win. If you convert the places that don't feel pedestrian friendly and don't support walking, biking, and transit to ones that do, you win. If you make it possible to walk, you win. And bike, you win. And if you can up your game with transit, like the city of Miami Beach has been doing with the trolleys, you win. If you just ignore the problem, thinking if you just ignore it, it'll go away, you don't win. So all planners and public officials and engineers know that our job is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. That's what justifies the expense on infrastructure. It's what justifies the consultants' fees. It's what justifies the jobs of many people in local government. And yet, if I see the shift change at the hospital results in people having to walk across a space like that because they aren't going to walk 3/4 of a mile to the nearest crosswalk, we lose. If I see Miami continuing to kill more pedestrians per 100,000 people in the population every year than any of our peer cities, we lose. If you can't comfortably ride a bike or walk, even when you have the right-of-way at the intersection, we lose. If you can't grow old in this place and go catch that public transit I just talked about without having to sit in that environment in the hot sun, you lose. This fellow was actually pretty good-natured. I did ask him after we shot the first photograph whether it would be okay to take his picture, and he was so happy to have somebody to talk to. And he grinned really big, so I had to use the original picture. But the truth is, this guy could end up in the emergency room this afternoon. Right? And if he did, someone there is going to diagnose him with heat stroke or dehydration or something like that. When in reality, he has a street tree deficiency. So, summary on this. If you're thinking about a big decision, whatever it is, a budget, what to build, a policy decision, zoning decision, an infrastructure decision, ask Ian Lockwood's question. If that thing you're going to do, the change you're about to make, favors shorter car trips and walking, biking, and transit, it will almost always be the right thing to do. In fact, I haven't found a single example yet where I wouldn't agree with it if that test is met. Now, if it only favors the long trip for the commuter who insists on driving alone, long distances, it might be the right thing to do, but only very rarely, because you could be making the problem worse rather than better through trying to solve it. So I think we have to change up our way of asking questions. The questions we used to ask were, how do we solve the congestion problem on behalf of that person who's driving alone, because this is America. That's the wrong question. And if the question we're being asked is how do we get all these cars moving again because they're stuck, that's the wrong question. The question we really need to ask is how do we move fewer people, fewer miles? The question we really ought to ask is how can we accelerate the shift to walking, biking, and transit? So even a larger percentage chooses those options even more often, even sooner. Now, in the Miami Beach Bike Ped Master Plan, there's a wonderful page everybody should look at, Tony will talk more about, that compares the modes of travel, driving, biking, transit, walking, and spaceship, or other. And today we're at about 20% for the bikes and peds combined, and there's a goal in there to try to very rapidly get to 26%, and then by 2035 get all the way to 32%, 55% total for walking, biking, and transit combined. Just to put that in perspective, in South Dade, say Pinecrest, Palmetto Bay, Cutler Bay, they are currently at about 1.5% of trips for walking, biking, and transit combined. So you are already the leaders in a big way. But what would happen if you went even farther? How much farther could you get? What's going to happen after your 2035 goal? Are you going to stop? No. You want to go farther still so that you start to liberate people. And the way you do that is you invest in things, rebuilding streets. There's a really important concept for Collins Avenue in North Beach, in the North Beach Master Plan. That's the kind of thing you could do. We will also need to invest in the hardware of transit in a much more robust way as a county and as cities. We'll have to switch from thinking of transportation equals cars and driving by myself to transportation equals mobility as a service, including all of the full menu, like ride-hailing services, bike shares, so on. We need to plant a zillion trees starting right now, because that's the most important piece of equipment we ever install, is a street tree. And we have to think about the links that make it possible for you to make that first or last mile trip to transit in order to avoid having to use a car to do it. Those are exactly the sort of links that are illustrated for 71st Street in the North Beach Master Plan, where take a close look at it and you'll see, let's see what's the way to go there. You'll see dedicated places to bike and dedicated lanes for transit where the bus can move without being stuck in traffic. I know we can do this. I told you I'm a carpetbagger from South Miami. In South Miami, we converted that to that. You'll see that again. 1992, 1996. It can be done, and it's been done in our lifetimes, in this place, and you don't have to figure it out all by yourself. Now, there's a big technology change coming, including the autonomous and connected vehicles, some of which we hope are parts of shared fleets and have more than one person in them. That will be a big game changer for us, and yeah, I have to ask you, have you thought about what Miami Beach will be like after the parking bubble bursts? How many of you in the room, just curious, looking at this age-diverse crowd, how many have taken an Uber or Lyft ride ever? Okay. You use it every day? When you get to the end of your trip, you don't need a parking space. And that vehicle can go serve somebody else on another trip. Prognosticators can't be trusted. As a planner, I know we're forecasters and we always get it wrong. But some of the prognosticators about this fact, ride-hailing services and autonomous vehicles, expect that the need in urban areas for parking will decrease by as much as 85%. Suppose they're only half right, 42.5%. It's a huge percentage of what we're currently doing with our land. I looked outside my hotel room in Austin, and all of that was parking. I looked outside my hotel room in Atlanta, and all of that was parking. And in Brickell Avenue, when you arrive on Metro Rail at transit-oriented development, what you see everywhere you look is parking, parking, parking. We're going to have room to do a lot of the things that have been difficult to do in the past. It won't come without problems. The most important thing you will need, invest in these lanes, street trees, it's all important. The most important thing we need is teamwork. So that's my handoff to Tony. Thank you very much.
it was worth waiting 15 years to have you come and talk about this. I just want to give everybody in the audience a little hope. We have a small audience, but we have some important people here who certainly understand what this is about, and certainly people who can carry our message forward to the leadership of this community. So I'd like to introduce Adrian Chamberlain, who is tell me exactly your, I know he's the executive director. He has so many people there, I'm not sure who's doing what. You're the executive director for Mayor Gelber.
Not quite. Aide to Mayor Gelber.
Okay.
But thank you.
Thank you, and I hope you'll carry some of our message back today. We also have Jose Gonzalez, who is the
Hero.
Transportation director.
who has the
Not
burden
executive.
on his back by all the people who are always complaining to him about exactly what we saw here today. So welcome and thank you very much for coming. And Elias Gonzalez, who is the aide to Commissioner Sanglin. And I know he's going to carry the message back. Commissioner Sanglin, of course, has worked as an interviewer and knows it. So I didn't want you to think we're just talking to ourselves. We do have good support here. So we expect to see all the changes that are being talked about.
I hope so. Cool. Well, thank you all for being here, and that's a tough act to follow. I'm going to be relatively quick. I think Victor covered a lot, and it's good for us to have a conversation. And I think maybe what I'll say is controversial, but maybe it shouldn't be. You know, I'm an architect, and one of the projects that I've worked on over many years, working with Jose and the Transportation Department staff on the bicycle pedestrian plan and your street design guide for your city, which is currently being implemented. And on a personal note, I have a lot of history here in the beach. It's a place that I've been coming to for as long as I can remember. Both of my grandparents lived here. When my son was born, my wife and I lived in North Beach, 1571 Bay Drive, North Bay Drive. And our firm was born here in 2009. My business partner lived here before he went back to New York. And so this is really where we started as a company. And as a place, it embodies how we feel about cities, and the compact urbanism that is reflected in the plan of South Beach is how we go around the whole country trying to talk about South Beach as an example, and North Beach, and the great urbanism that we have here in Miami Beach as a great example for other cities. Part of my career, the first part of my career, I spent working with Victor's wife, Madi Chael, as an architect. And in my spare time, I did advocacy for transportation and transit and better bike lanes and better bicycle infrastructure. It's kind of how I backed into transportation planning as a vocation for my firm. And I brought that experience, I think, to all of our projects, specifically with regard to you know, this Miami Beach plan. In many ways, our firm wouldn't exist without this project. It gave us a big boost in terms of being able to continue our work. And one of the things that I'm most proud of with this plan is that we're really trying to set the city up and set city staff up to be able to do both short-term and long-term projects. Most of the time, transportation projects just give you that larger-term vision of what you should do. And we did give that longer-term vision, but we also kind of backed into what can you do today and tomorrow and over the course of the next 2 or 3 years to get things moving. And I'm really proud of the work that the city's done in accelerating some of this work in the interim, while some of the more aspirational projects, like this Dave Boulevard project, I know many of you probably have been following this for years, trying to get that project moving forward in a permanent way. There are interim steps that can happen, and we did that for, 30 to 40 different streets all around the city. We rode and walked around every single street in the city, documented them, and then gave the city a roadmap moving forward, both in the plan and in the street design guide. And your street design guide gives you really detailed recommendations for how to improve safety for walkers, pedestrians, cyclists, and people who are using transit. And as it turns out, really, there's a lot more folks here who are walking and using transit and biking then we like to acknowledge. You know, as a county anyway, we're used to thinking about this place as a car place. But as it turns out, Miami Beach is not typical of that at all. When you take into account the people who come here from out of town, your daytime population doubles. This is a city that is larger than, you know, many small American cities, and it's connected to this huge metropolis. When you look at south of Dade Boulevard, south of here, on any given day, more than half of the population is on foot, biking, or in transit. And that is enough of a reason to think differently about how we plan for that area than any other reason that Victor or I can give you. There are already people walking and biking and taking transit. It's already there. People are already doing this. So we should not double down on the car-centered infrastructure that is not servicing these people. We should actually help them walk and bike and really acknowledge that that's one of the great things about Miami Beach, and specifically south of here. And this is a similar statistic can be made for North Beach. North Beach is a very compact, walkable community, and if not everybody walks or bikes there currently. One of the things I'm most proud of in this plan, as Victor noted, was the mode share goals. I think before, I was pretty aggressive, I think, with staff saying, we need to have goals. How can you just have a plan that doesn't say where you want to be in 5, 10, 15 years from the overall perspective? And this is, by the way, these are not number of trips, these are number of people. When you look at your population and who's riding to work, just as your census population, that's where these numbers came from. And then you add in the number of tourists who are here without a car, as documented by the Visitor Bureau. That's where these numbers come from. And so I thought it was important to know that as a starting point, and then to say, how are you going to make your decisions? How are you going to invest in the infrastructure in the city if you don't know where you want to go? So sometime, I think this was in March of 2015, this is a full year before this plan was even adopted, the commission said, we want to have priority for bicycles, pedestrians, and transit riders over cars. And that, to me, is a huge shift in the whole city planning history. And so it was only not even 2 years ago. I mean, 2 years ago, last year, so almost 3 years ago. But the big question is, how do you get there? How do you get to 60% non-motorized, 50-something% non-motorized when you include 2% coming by spaceship, right? Those are people who work at home or who use rideshare services. How do you get to 60% non-motorized in 20 years? And there's 4 main things, I think. And this is some tough love. We're playing good cop, bad cop. Victor gave you the philosophical, beautiful reason why. I'm going to give you the actual facts on the ground, what you need to do to get to people actually walking and biking more in the next 20 years. And number one is implement Baylane. You need to have a metro rail connection to the mainland where you can take part of those 200,000 people coming by car and put them in a train so that they don't have to have a car when they get here. People like Victor and myself who come here on a regular basis would never come by car if I could go to South Miami Station, like I go to all my meetings downtown, and come here to City Hall. And the fact is that your land use supports it. This is the perfect place for a metro rail. I would not invest $1 anywhere else in the county before I invest in a train that comes here where you could land the train at 5th and Alton and literally walk anywhere in 10 minutes. Easy. You just take a whole mess of people off the road just by doing this one thing. Number 2, you have a parking fetish. A serious parking fetish. When you invest this much design fees and time in creating beautiful parking garages, that's a problem. And it's not just the parking garages. What I didn't show here was your on-street parking, which is fought over, right? Like crazy. Our colleague, Jason King, who just moved from the beach to very close to where I live in South Miami, he used to tell me, all of these ideas are great, but don't touch my parking. He used to live on Euclid. If we ever touched his parking, he would freak out, right? And he is a new urbanist, he's one of us. So I understand the pain points, but there's a better use for that infrastructure than it has on-street parking. And I think the bigger question is, for an educated audience like this, is what is your postcard image? In 100 years, when you look at the marketing materials of this time, what are they showing? Unless it's retrofit. And I really, my hat's off to the commission for being forward-thinking and saying, you know, what are we going to do with all these buildings afterwards and having a retrofit plan? But what does it say about your city, about the values of your city, that your postcard image today in 2018 and 2017 is a parking lot? It's a problem. It's no longer the beach, right? It's kind of a problem. And the fact is that you look at cities all around the world, and I think Victor kind of pointed this out already, but I'll reiterate it. Just look at these aerials in Washington and Boston. These buildings don't have parking. Some of the most dense cities in the whole world don't have parking garages everywhere. What's that?
They have trains.
And they have trees. Not to mention,
Trains.
what's that? Trains.
Trains.
Well, that was,
Subways.
that's
And
my
subways.
first point here, right? You need the train. You need some sort of transit. And then, Victor already said this, so I can run through this. Don't solve for congestion. That gives you diminishing returns. That's the wrong question. Solving for congestion is a waste of time. Capacity projects. With respect to my friends at the city, because I know this is a conversation we have a lot. Don't look for capacity improvements in your street network anymore. Think about other ways that you're going to have people move around, walking, biking, and taking transit, period. This is the result of chasing after that congestion, after the congestion relief. You get a road like Alton Road.
There's no congestion there.
No, not at the time that this is taken. You go there at 5 o'clock, not great. But the bigger question is this a place you actually want to be? With the number of people that are actually walking and biking there, there's no crosswalks. The street trees are really far set back. You don't need this much capacity on the street. 4 cars, period. It's absurd. Here's another graphic. I think Victor kind of touched on this in a way. In many cases, and this is just from Wisconsin, traffic projections by DOTs are always vastly overstated to justify these sorts of capacity increases. Documented every year on year, you expect that capacity to increase for whatever reason to justify highway expansion at the outer edge of the city, and simply doesn't ever materialize, or you induce a problem that wasn't there to begin with. And I think most topical for today's conversation, something that we never hear about in our conversation today about gun control and gun rights, more people die in car crashes and on collisions with bicyclists and pedestrians than are killed every year by handguns. I mean, that is something that should be shocking to everybody, and you never hear one word about it in the media. More people die because of cars and the way that we design our roads than because of guns. And I mean, this is a little bit outdated at this point, but when you look at the design and the safety of our streets in the state of Florida, for years, the top 4 most dangerous streets in the whole country, cities in the whole country for bicycles and pedestrians are right here in the state of Florida. Jacksonville, Orlando, Miami, and Tampa. And in fact, if you look at the 2015 numbers for Miami-Dade County, there were about almost 120 fatalities, bicyclist and pedestrian fatalities. That's 2 per week for the entire year, people dying because they were walking and biking in a place that is not designed for that.
I came here from Washington, D.C. And one of the things I noticed when I came here was how many fatalities there are all the time.
All the time.
Traffic fatalities.
All the time. And when you look at cities like Washington, it's not like they have significantly more. In fact, per capita and in comparison with the number of people who are actually walking and biking, there are fewer fatalities in comparison to the quantity of people.
And I can tell you the reason why. I used to live in DC as well. The biggest difference is enforcement. The police were very aggressive there for any type of citations. They had cameras as well for anybody running red lights, and we don't have that issue. We have a big problem here with the police not wanting to cite people and go the extra mile to make our
Enforcement
streets
is
safe.
definitely one issue, I think, but from our point of view, design is a bigger issue. Your streets have a different design. They're slower in other cities than they are here. It's a FDOT problem. I'm not going to go into it. I don't want to cause a stir. The 4th thing that I think that you need to do to get to that longer term goal is accelerate that change. Don't wait for the longer term silver bullet big projects, right? There are a lot of things that you can do right now to make that change happen. Most of the time in our work, it's half the time we do transportation planning, the other half we do something called tactical urbanism. Some of you have heard me talk about this already. We show renderings like this, or the renderings that Victor showed, where we're trying to convert the ratio of automotive space to people space. to something that looks like this, potentially, right? More space for people on bike or walking or in transit. And we are faced with really angry crowds, not dissimilar from you all, perhaps. Angry elected officials, angry engineering staff, angry residents who think that we're going to make their commute bad or we're going to introduce the wrong type of people in their neighborhood. And so our challenge has been how to convince those people that it's more than just a rendering. There's positive benefits from this rendering that you can't understand from the rendering alone, and you have to actually experience. And so one of the things that we've developed as a practice is this whole idea of tactical urbanism. Victor showed a slide in Coral Gables that's happening right now, a test, and it's just a test of what that infrastructure looks like in the real world. It's very hard to argue with reality when you see it, right? And this is, for example, this is a project we did in Burlington. As part of their bicycle pedestrian master plan, we did actual demonstration projects. So instead of having a meeting like this, where we would, I mean, we did a lot of this also, but have a meeting at 6 o'clock somewhere in a cafeteria, we actually have people come out with us and build the infrastructure in the real world so that they can see what it looks like. And it's really hard to argue with the reality on the ground. And what happens is the people who are the most angry and the most against the work that we do, when they go out and help build the infrastructure, they realize how wrong they were about it, and they actually support it. And this was a test of a one-day bike lane, just a one-day bike lane. You can really tell that that wasn't there before. Part of it is taking great photos and doing the documentation before and after. And when we think about these projects and we look at the examples all around the world, there are 4 main characteristics. They're very inexpensive, and they're meant to be temporary. Could be 1 month, could be 1 year, could be 3 years. But there's not a really heavy infrastructure investment made on behalf of the city or the citizenry, so it's easier to change those projects moving forward if there are things that go wrong. You think about our public works projects in general, and I'm saying this as a consultant who designs these types of projects. We wait years and we spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars on infrastructure that gets built to realize that there are fundamental flaws with that project, all the time. And there's no way to undo it because you've already made up the political or financial investment. And this methodology allows you to incrementally deliver projects without making heavy investments until you actually know the public is behind it and it works in the manner that the consultants have said it works, which is not always the case, right? And you can find a lot of this online, tacticalurbanismguide.com. It's all free, it's open source. You can then send emails to Jose Gonzalez and tell him we want to do this really cool crosswalk project in the middle of Collins. And here's a sort of graphic that explains how that breaking down the project delivery process works. You start with a one-day demonstration, a pop-up something, and that has its own material language. And then you can go into the 1 month to 1 year, and then there's interim design. This is 1 year to 5 years. That's like the plaza example that Victor showed, or Times Square. Many of you know the example of Times Square. That project took a very similar trajectory towards the long-term capital plan. But I like to say about that project, if they had started by hiring an architect to do a rendering of the project, we would still be talking about the rendering of that project instead of how awesome it is to be in Times Square in the middle of a plaza. And it's because they went out one day with cones and they just closed the street. And that was it. They didn't get a traffic study for it. They didn't ask NYC DOT. They just went and did it. And then they iterated on it and had a design done and all that. It's about rethinking our process of project delivery. And we've done this before here in South Florida. This is a project that we did with students from the Dreyfus School of the Arts. A high school, design high school, okay? Over the course of 3 days and $15,000 this was done. Can you imagine this as a public works project that the city sponsors? It would take hundreds of thousands of dollars and years, committee after committee, arts committee, transportation, art committee. This was done and led by high school students. I didn't participate. I coached them along, I answered questions, and I'm hugely proud of this project. Now they can make improvements on it. They didn't invest a whole lot of money in it, and it's still visually pretty amazing. So I think that the PS to this whole conversation is that you have a lot of work to do in your streets, raising the streets, addressing sea level rise. Use it as an opportunity. Think about other cities that have had to do similar type of work. Chicago, for example, when they had to raise their streets. You have a moment that not very many cities have, And specifically with regard to your geo projects coming up, that investment should be made to actually addressing all of these at a systemic level. You can actually do really important, large-scale things now in a way that the rest of us really can't. And coming soon, in this whole vein, is the Ruben Dome project. Paulo, to your question about implementation of the North Beach plan, this is going to be your first step towards the creation of that permanent plaza at Ruben Dome that Victor was showing. And this is happening in the next month or so. The city's working on getting the materials. We will be there. I will be there with a roller. And all of you are invited to come and help paint. This is not going to take that long, actually. And this is a design that's inspired by Art Deco windows, stained glass windows. And it'll be there for a couple of years until the city does a permanent project, some sort of more permanent plaza.
So you're closing it?
Closed, yes, absolutely.
And Friday night live concerts or whatever they are?
On a regular basis. That is something that
perfect.
is TBD.
Are we saying chairs?
There's going to be benches, and see, this is part of the methodology, right? So we met with the city last week, and we said, is there a place that you store your old furniture or park furniture that's not being used? Well, we don't really know. Let's ask this department. And then they sent us to that department. And at the end of the day, we found the depot where all the stuff is being held. We don't have to buy anything new.
Do we have tables and
You
chairs?
have tables and chairs. You have tables and chairs.
But my question was, will you continue to have the farmer's market on the weekend?
Yes, the first programming before anything else happens is going to be the first Fridays. There is not, at least from our point of view, we're not going to be doing any programming. That's going to be the next thing. And really that happens when there is an organized constituency of people that really want to make that happen. It's not necessarily...
Farmers market's there too.
No, I know, that's what I'm saying. The farmer's market is that first step. But beyond that, Friday night movie nights there. Or,
They have a Friday night concert once a month there too.
That's the sort of thing that you can accelerate now that you're going to have this space closed on a regular basis, permanent basis. So that's it. Thank you.
Yep. So I know it's late, and actually the way that we had this planned out was that Victor and Tony were going to do a much larger presentation, and I was just going to sort of close it up, and then we'll take questions and answers. And basically everything that they said is correct. So I've done a better job.
Good to know.
That's really, yeah. Tony did a good job of highlighting a lot of the efforts that the city is doing. And I would also just like to say that historically, Miami Beach is very lucky because we have really good bones. Victor showed a really good slide of Espanola Way when it was first built. And Miami Beach, like a lot of the early turn of the century cities in the South Florida area, like the Gables, like certain areas of Miami, were built on a very definable grid that had an interconnection of street and sidewalks built in, narrow streets. And that's primarily because these areas were all laid out, platted, and built prior to the Federal Highway Act in the 1950s. All you have to do is go a few miles to the west into Kendall and West Egg to see the difference between a post-Federal Highway Act city and a pre-Federal Highway Act city. And that's not to say that those areas that need a lot more intervention can't change, but in Miami Beach, because we have the successful bones built in already, the amount of work that we have to do is not as significant. Nevertheless, because of a lot of the changes to roadway configuration during the 1960s, during the 1970s, we still have a lot of catching up to do. People may not know this, and LTC came out last week. Jose actually sent me a copy of it, but Miami Beach was recently awarded the Safe and Complete Streets Award by Miami-Dade County. And so that was a culmination of a lot of different efforts. You've probably seen the bike lanes that have gone up throughout the city. There's been a real effort to incorporate street trees. Some of the things that we found challenging in that regard is underground infrastructure. What we've seen through a lot of our streetscape improvements is that there's been a lot of surprises, and these will sometimes impact what type of street trees that we can put. There are, however, technologies evolving that will allow street trees to go into very narrow areas, like the use of a technology called silva cells. They've been used very effectively in areas of the city that don't have a lot of underground space that allows significant root balls and canopy trees to grow. They're expensive, so sometimes the city ends up getting into fights with new development projects over the cost of that, but it's one of those things where the city, if we continue to be diligent, we can have a very effective street canopy, street tree canopy. Likewise with bike lanes. One of the biggest debates that I've seen over the years is whether or not bike lanes should come at the expense of travel lanes or parking spaces. And whether or not it's one or both, I think it's one of those things where consciously the city is going to have to take that step to make sure it's one or the other and not at the expense of the bike lane, because we're a built-out city and oftentimes there's not going to be enough room for all three: on-street parking, 2 travel lanes, and significant sidewalks and bike lanes. We're going to have to make a choice. And street trees. We're going to have to make that choice, and oftentimes it can be a difficult choice, particularly if you're a person that's living in that area and you're relying on on-street parking. So, lastly, I think that building design also plays a very, very important role in complete streets and streetscape design. Parking requirements require curb cuts, and curb cuts, more often than not, are going to have a very negative impact upon streetscape design, particularly if it's multiple buildings throughout a block that have curb cuts, that have access to what people believe are needs for on-street, off-street parking. The city shares that responsibility with its own parking codes. Clearly, the city has been over the years moving in the direction of having less of a parking requirement, but it's something that continues to be studied and it's something that continues to be talked about among affected stakeholders and among policymakers. One of the examples I always like to point out is how we, in instances where we have gone from uses that were very heavy in terms of vehicular orientation and uses to new uses that don't require any type of vehicle access and the impact that that has on the street. And, to give you a good visual reference, I'm sure a lot of you remember the BP station that was on 13th Street and Collins Avenue. For decades, that was a number of gas stations with multiple curb cuts, and it was probably one of the worst corners to be around on Collins Avenue. Since it's become a Walgreens that doesn't have any on-street, off-street parking, we now have a building holding that urban edge with appropriate space between the building and the sidewalk. And those are the types of things where visually you can see what a major benefit it is going from a use that is very vehicular oriented to one that doesn't require any vehicle access. And when you think about how that could be multiplied, luckily in Miami Beach, we don't have a lot, most of the built environment doesn't have that already. But when you talk about new infill development, particularly in residential areas, having to provide curb cuts where a curb cut didn't exist in order to provide off-street parking where it previously exists over time, that can have a collective impact on complete streets. So with that, that's all I was going to add. The three of us are up here. We can take any questions and answer any questions that you have.
Wonderful. They told you everything you need to know, and it's in the coming years that hopefully you will see. It's interesting to hear all this, Tony. I applaud you. You have been talking about, let's back off all this car driving and have something else. How many years have you been
Every
telling
year.
us? Every year. Every year. And believe it or not, Miami Beach United is about to oppose someone who would like to take his vacant parking lot and build, he can build to 50 feet and make a parking garage if that's what he wants in the middle of the historic district. He wants to go to 75 feet so we can have more parking. So you see that the issues still continue. And we hope that by educating the public and thanking you for coming to understand what can happen that is positive. So I applaud you. We're going to fight you back in about 3-4 years to see if you change because of today.
See if you remain united.
So far, so good. We've been at it for 6 years, so we're okay. Thank you.
We have a question?
I have a quick question. So I really like the idea of tactical urbanism, and actually I'm born and raised in Hialeah, so I saw the change that kind of Brickell specifically has gone, where before you only drove there, but now my friends that live there are like, nah man, come here, I don't drive anymore, right? And a big part of that is a lot of what you're saying, but it's also the developers, right? You get developers to create things that make it efficient to walk to. It's not just making a Walgreens, it's making a restaurant, whatever. So I guess my question is, how does the developer aspect kind of feed into making something walkable and pedestrian friendly? Because I feel like that wasn't touched upon.
Well, the first thing to recognize is that everything we like that's in the built environment in our cities was done, probably, a vast majority of it anyway, was done by a developer. That when we talk about real estate development, we're talking about this enormous public-private partnership where the city is traditionally responsible for a lot of that stuff between buildings that I talked about, but the private investor, developer is responsible for building the rest of that ensemble, which includes the walls of that public room made by the private buildings. Now, real estate developers they're not all the same, but as an industry, I have to say, over the last 25 or 30 years, they've dramatically shifted their product focus and their emphasis away from the car-oriented sprawl, which dominated everything, to preferring to do the projects that have built-in infrastructure already. They don't have to build in the cities that are already started, and preferring to do mixed use and moderately higher densities, and to use more of their land productively rather than less. But they find that they are kind of imprisoned by the land development regulations that enforce all the wrong things. Deep setbacks on the front, rear, and sides of the buildings, low percentages of the lot allowed to be covered by buildings, excessively strict height restrictions in many places, and worst of all, the high minimum parking requirements that I think all three of us touched on. So those are working against the better instincts of savvy investors, but they go along with them because local government says they won't have it any other way. So if you want to unite around something, unite around repealing minimum parking requirements. We have a pretty big message to the development community that what you want is a place where the decisions aren't done in the architectural design, the site plan, everything around the car first, and everything else comes after that. And that's the way to get at it. Now, that doesn't mean they won't provide parking. Of course they'll provide parking. They'll provide the amount that is reasonably matched to the market and to the requirements of their bank and their tenant. So it needs a project as opposed to the inevitably higher demands placed on them by local government. And developers also get bashed pretty hard for things like not doing enough affordable housing. Well, if you saddle every unit with the cost of providing an essentially free parking space, the cost of which is embedded in the cost of the unit, the dwelling, then don't say you want affordable housing on one hand and then say you want high minimum parking requirements on the other. It's a great idea to remove that cost from the backs of the well-intentioned developers. Now, I started by saying all developers are not created equal. You can send a message about which kind of developer you want. The one that builds the walkable, compact, complete, character-rich community, or the one that builds conventional auto-oriented sprawl. Maybe it's not in the Everglades or the farmland in Deep West Dade. It could still be sprawl right here in the city. Tell them, and make it very clear which one you want. And I think the city has been doing just that. Some of the times they do it with the support of the neighborhood groups, and sometimes they don't.
I'll add to that just briefly. One of the things that I believe needs to happen moving forward, and I've had this discussion with Jose and his staff, is the need for better data on what current parking requirements really are. Because most cities, they base their parking requirements on these very archaic models from the Green Book. And they're suburban based. And while they may work in Kendall and Plantation, they don't work in urbanized areas.
They don't work in Kendall or Plantation either.
Yeah, but unfortunately, there's a dearth of available data on TODs and on areas that just don't need the same level of parking because of the walkability. And I was at a ULI seminar about a year ago, and it was on transit-oriented development, and they had two developers on the panel. And they said something very interesting that struck me. They were developing some projects in Miami-Dade, right on the Metro rail line, and they didn't want to provide any transit. And it wasn't the county that told them to provide parking. It was their banks. Their banks had this archaic formula based upon some engineering handbook of 2-point-something spaces per 1,000 square foot of retail. And the developer showed them all this data about why they didn't need to provide the off-street parking because of their proximity to transit, because of their proximity to bicycle networks, sidewalk networks, everything. And the loan reviewers and the banks kept saying, no, this data says we need 2-point whatever spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail. So the need for that empirical data showing that that level of off-street parking storage, I think, is also critical.
Right? I would add to that I think we didn't say, but I'll put a fine point on it, is that what you thought, your intuition about walkability and about what makes Brickell perhaps successful is that there's things to walk to. Urbanism, great compact urbanism is infrastructure. It's walking infrastructure at its heart, for sure. When you think about the suburban model, there is a suburban problem in Miami Beach. It's the resort style buildings like you have all throughout Mid-Beach. You have a huge amount of density in Mid-Beach, huge density numbers. Except you can't walk in Mid-Beach because all those buildings are set one full story above the street level and super far back, and you have to walk through a portico share to get there. There's nothing actually, like you're saying, there's not a store there. So I mean, I think that the regulations play a huge part, and part of that is the development.
But I think the regulations, don't you agree, need to be accompanied by some education effort, because people need to be re-educated as to what it means to have something like this versus what we do have. I happen to be one of those people who lives in Mid-Beach, and boy, it's horrible. I mean, we're now having a building built across the street from us, and they have 2-level underground parking is what they're planning. Underground parking, right on the street.
Undersea parking?
I don't think
Undersea parking?
I don't think that we need to educate people. I think you are going to intuitively know. People know cities. We're not living in a bubble here. We've traveled to New York, to Washington, to Boston. You came from another place, right? When there's good urbanism, people know it right away. You don't need to be re-educated. It's going to happen. And as more people come here from other places, they're not going to need to be re-educated anyway, because that's going to be the experience in another place, and it's just going to be great. Now there's sun hauling the whole year, and I get to walk around.
Developers here are building these mega luxury
Yes.
apartments, and there is one building that has parking in people's home. I mean, the car
portion,
goes-
yeah.
I mean, it's outrageous what's
Yeah,
happening.
I mean, I think there's a level of education that happens. That's Victor's job, that's Tom's job in terms of educating the developers. Absolutely.
Thank you for your presentation tonight. I really appreciate what you guys did and the insight that you shared with the group. One of the slides that definitely caught my attention is the issue regarding the incidents of fatalities, pedestrian accidents versus our peer cities. What do you think as a city that we can do now to help improve upon that? It's definitely a serious issue.
Slow the cars.
Fatalities myself.
Great question. Slow the cars. Because if you want the fatalities to decrease in number,
And that's a good slide.
when collisions do occur, you need to occur at very slow speeds. And we've been, you saw the Alton Road design that Tony showed a picture of. That's a type, and that means if you design, pick a lower number and design for slower speeds. and then enforce that through the design, not just through the signage, but through the physical design, not just through the
What's the
enforcement,
best
but through all
physical
three.
design that you recommend for that? What's the
speed-
best physical design that you recommend?
Slow, that's what I'm getting
Calm the
at.
traffic.
In general, narrower is best, and that, so less generous lanes, because more wide open spaces is a clear invitation to higher speeds. Everything you put in the field of vision of a motorist will also be a thing to get their attention and add some friction, some good cholesterol to that system. So the rows of street trees, they're like a constant reminder. If I don't pay attention or I start to speed up and I lose control, I'm going to wrap my car around that tree, I'm going to slow down. For 50 or 60 years, the engineering habit was to say, gosh, every once in a while, some 17-year-old inebriated male is going to drive too fast and they might hit that tree. Let's just not plant any trees at all and be safer. The result of that way of thinking was to make all the streets fast and all the trips faster than they were supposed to be, instead of just the occasional errant one. And so we have to switch that mentality. The good news is, the engineers know this already. They just need to be given permission by the public and the politicians to use what they know in their engineering knowledge. Their whole bookshelf of engineering literature has changed in the last 10 years, from the wider roads or faster roads or better roads philosophy that we've been criticizing, to the slow is safe and slow is beautiful details. Your city's been making that policy adjustment. Every time you see one of the streets improved, it's probably been in their minds.
Which city?
That is something that you need to give them explicit permission to act on and be more aggressive with. That's my opinion.
I think Victor hit the nail on the head. I'll also tell you from my own experience that physical changes are what really works, because while enforcement is good, you're just not going to have a police officer at every corner 24/7. You know? And one of the things in my experience that I've seen is that the easy part is designing it, because we have a lot of talented people, including talented engineers now, who are thinking a lot less about moving cars and how to slow them down. So the technology is there. It's not rocket science. It's very easy to do. In my experience, the political will to build and maintain them is what is the most challenging, because you are going to slow the car down. And so the car driver is not going to be happy anymore, because that car driver, it's going to take that car driver that much longer. So the will to be able to preference the pedestrian on the sidewalk over the car driver is probably the most critical element.
I'm going to take you back to Main Beach again, on Collins Avenue.
Okay.
And the fact that, I think they said, there was a study and they said that there were 800 accidents in many years. It was really an amazing number of accidents. And the number of fatalities is amazing, because I hear about them all the time, and the traffic gets all clogged up. The Department of Transportation is now planning to redo Collins Avenue, that section, the section between 41st and 63rd Street. And they're going to change our 10 stoplights for 5, which then will make people go faster. I mean, people go fast enough on Collins. And I think it's horrible. They think it's a highway. And now they're going to make it more of a highway by eliminating the lights. Doesn't make sense at all.
That doesn't make sense at all. I agree.
We actually have a meeting February 28th with FDOT upper management to discuss several concerns that we have with that project, including the reduction of crosswalks from 10 to 5. So by reducing the number of signals, they're reducing the number of crosswalks as well. So it's a big concern.
That sounds like a big step in the wrong direction, just on its face.
It doesn't make sense at all.
Yes, shocking.
My wife and I, about 15 years ago, looked all over the United States and the East Coast to find a livable European type of a city. And this is the only place that we enjoy to see and to buy and to live here. To walk. And to walk, actually. It's a walkable place. And I congratulate you that you would like to make improvements in this. This is a wonderful thing that you do. Thank you.
This is the beach's brand, isn't it? And you can either enhance and continue to extend that brand, that image and identity, that impression that you got when you took that travel and picked it, or you can worsen it and tarnish it, then you should do the former, not the latter.
Yeah.